Web of Lies. Chapter 1. A Disgruntled Shunter. The shadowy black Shunter coasted back and forth across the yard, heaving and hauling things into their proper places. There was a marked contempt in every movement. The coaches hadn't done anything to him, of course, but the railway had, at least from his perspective, and that made him rough and careless. The coaches didn't like him one bit. The search for a station pilot had been turbulent. It seemed that every time a suitable replacement was found to shunt Tidmouth yards, they either proved themselves so heartily that the Fat Controller had to award them with another position, or they resented the workload and the station yard politics so much that they had refused to continue. In total, 7 different engines had done the job over the last few decades, for varying lengths of time. There was only one constant: Diesel. Devious Diesel to his enemies. His friends didn't have a name for him, because he didn't have any. But even he hadn't done the job consistently. He had left and come back 5 or 6 times himself. Every time he was sent away in disgrace. He'd either told lies about the other engines, or caused some accident due to his temper. Most commonly, it was his treachery that kept sending him away, back to the other railway. What they called treachery, Diesel thought, he called cleverness. Just because they were all too daft to understand his greater aims did not make him a villain. It only made him a martyr. Well, this is what Diesel thought, anyway. And yet he would keep coming back, and the Fat Controller, the identity of which varied by the year, would reluctantly accept him. Diesel supposed that spoke to how desperate the state of Tidmouth Yard really was. There really was no one else willing. Many of the other engines wondered why Diesel kept returning to a place he so loathed. No doubt he had some nefarious plan he wanted to try out. The truth was, all of Britain ran on diesel fuel now, every stretch of the network. All except for Sodor. And that drove Diesel mad. The revolution had yet to fully succeed. He was thinking, of course, about the revolution that had started over 30 years ago with the invention of the diesel engine. After this long, a sensible engine might question if it still qualified as a revolution at all. But Diesel could not afford to be sensible. Not after dedicating so much of his life to the cause. Now, by all measures, diesel engines had won the traction wars. They were everywhere, did all important work, and yet Diesel could not accept that there was this one small outlier. His work was not done. Sodor was not yet subjugated. If he had been a scholar of history, he would know that that was always the case with the island of Sodor, even going back to medieval times. But, like many a vain English conqueror before him, Diesel believed his conquest would succeed. So he returned every few years with a new scheme, and as he shuffled a new rake of coaches into the station, he snickered to himself. He had a good feeling about this one. He was already setting things in motion. Come tomorrow morning, he would be embarking on one of his greatest schemes to date. Until then, he had to tolerate this island, as he'd been tolerating it for about a year now. And it had been insufferable. The loud, hissing, uncouth behavior of these engines irritated him immensely. The way the management prioritized emotion over operation at every turn repulsed him. And the way they glorified these engines, romanticized them, was the most repugnant part of... Diesel paused. He suddenly felt sick. "That wasn't there yesterday," he said gravely, in his oily voice. It hung there, 10 feet tall and high off the ground, affixed to one of the massive brick walls of the station concourse. It was an enormous poster of Thomas the Tank Engine. He looked rather strange, but it was him. This is exactly what Diesel detested about this island, summed up in a single image. His oil grew hot enough to boil as he stared up at the daft advertisement. He muttered under his breath, "The fools." I know, right? Diesel nearly jumped out of his frames. He thought for a moment the poster had spoken. Then he realized the genuine article had pulled up right beside him. Thomas looked indignant. They got me all wrong. Britt said that the television program would be a spitting image, but she made me so short. And who in their right mind can call that a short, stumpy funnel? It looks like they swapped it for Duncan's. Diesel already had a headache. He'd been in Thomas's presence for less than 10 seconds, and his radiator fan was already going stiff. He had so many questions he barely wanted the answers to. He picked one. Who is Britt? A TV producer. She said that I was a very special engine because of the books. And, I am a very special engine. I'm not too humble to deny that. But when she said she'd make a show about me, well, I didn't think it was going to be so imaginative. Thomas's voice trailed off. Diesel couldn't follow him. His fan had nearly seized now. This engine's constant yammering, almost always about nothing of importance, was like sugar in the tank to him. Diesel was driven by efficiency, a need to accomplish things swiftly and to great effect. If there was a purpose to Thomas listing off all of his merchandise ranges in the middle of the biggest station on the line, blocking a vital crossover track 5 minutes before the 3:30 Wellsworth local arrived, then Diesel certainly could not see it. Right, he thought. Time to put a stop to this. And look, I didn't not like the taste of eggs, but all that property damage, oh man, I felt terrible. And they mix badly with the ash, too. Enough! That's enough. Stop talking now. Thomas stopped starkly. For a moment, Diesel wondered if he knew what those words even meant. All right, geez. I don't know why you're staring up at my poster like that if you're not interested. Diesel scowled at the tank engine and belched that ghastly black-green smoke he always made when he was angry. Thomas was coated in black dust. He coughed helplessly. Rude! You're in a passenger station, you know. People wear suits here. But Diesel had already run around the train and begun dragging the empty coaches to the carriage shed, spinning his wheels rapidly. He couldn't get out of there fast enough. That night, Tidmouth Sheds was a full house. It was brimming with light and laughter. Thomas was still in town. He swaggered into the engine sheds, took a rather showboating spin on the classy wooden turntable which accented him brilliantly, and at last he settled in comfortably between Percy and Edward. "Oh, it's good to be home," said Percy with a cherub smile. "We're not home, we're visiting," corrected Thomas, but he did it politely. "Farquhar is home." "They're both home," insisted Percy. "And when we leave home and go back to home, I'm going to say the same thing to Toby." "I do wish he'd come by," said Edward gingerly. "He's more than welcome." Thomas just chuckled. "With all this noise? Nah, this isn't his scene. No way can I picture that old fuddy-duddy lasting 5 minutes. And then Thomas twitched as he was drowned out by Gordon's bellowing laughter from across the room. Truth be told, it's even a bit much for me. Edward just smiled encouragingly. He lowered his voice, and a once broad conversation narrowed to only include him and Thomas. 2 old friends. The oldest friends. "Thank you for coming," he said earnestly. Branch line's slow this time of night," Thomas said aloofly, but his tone of voice wasn't fooling anyone. His involuntarily wholesome smile spoke volumes. "It's not often we get to do this these days," the older engine carried on dreamily. "It's the best part of my week." His eyes sparkled in a way that Thomas only ever saw on nights like these, in the company of those dearest to him. "It's not so bad," Thomas half agreed. "Gordon's more tolerable these days." But Thomas couldn't deny. It felt nice to have them all under one roof. It would be wildly impractical to do this every night. They did, after all have their own lives. But once in a while, it was quite pleasant. "I'm always surprised by how roomy this place is." Thomas looked around, trying not to seem too impressed. "Well, it is one of the only buildings on the railway you had no hand in," chuckled Edward. "Besides the ones I handled, of course." "I'm still sure I built more than you," he teased. Edward only tutted. Now, neither of us built anything, Thomas. We only delivered materials and men." "I'd say that counts as building," he declared with a smirk. "But this place, well, it's nice, but it's never been home." "Admittedly, it was a big change, going from that little 4-berth shed to a proper roundhouse. It'd throw anyone for a loop, especially considering you weren't here for the renovations." "Yeah, but that's not what I mean. I mean Tidmouth as a whole. Edward couldn't help but let a small sigh escape his cylinders. Tidmouth had been the headquarters of the North Western Railway since the 1920s, but Thomas still hadn't embraced it. He was stubborn that way. To be fair, he had never operated out of here like the rest of them had. He had lived in Vickerstown first, and then Wellsworth, and finally and presently Farquhar. It was strange. The most famous engine on the island, and the most famous station on the line, had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Edward didn't say that aloud, though, especially not the bit about the most famous engine. Perish the thought. Thomas's eyes worked their way around the room. There were far more engines here than just numbers 1 through 6. Others were peppered throughout, chattering happily. Emily stood regally beside Henry, explaining to him how to assert his dominance when the shunters at Barrow gave him grief. Murdoch stood alone. While the tracks to his left and right were occupied, he had backed all the way up to the buffers and gone to sleep early, though he didn't look like he was sleeping well. Derek and Boko were trying their best to explain multi-directionalism to Gordon, who, far short of understanding the concept, was still hung up on the word. It was a very lively house tonight. But Thomas couldn't help but notice an empty berth, to the left of Derek. He knew who should have been there. He raised the concern to the room. "Where's Diesel?" "Which one of them? There are a lot," asked James glibly. The sentence wasn't very tasteful, especially the pointed use of the term them. But considering that only a few years ago James had resented all Diesels, growing pains were to be expected. He was trying, that's all that mattered. "The one called Diesel, James," corrected Henry delicately.
"Oh, him. What, are we all afraid to say the devious out loud now?" lamented the red engine.
"James, we've been over this," Edward said, as gracefully as he could manage. "He'll never change if we keep calling him by that adjective."
"Perhaps," grumbled James, "but there's only so much you can ask of me."
"Is it a lot to ask, showing respect to your fellow engines?"
asked Gordon gravely.
"Of course not. Oh, don't get the wrong idea. I love Diesels." And he turned to the engines beside him. "Boko, you are superb."
"Thank you," said Boko in the stiffest possible voice. It was something. Not perfect by any means, but he was getting there.
"Diesel sleeps elsewhere,"
said Gordon plainly, steering the conversation firmly back on course.
"He doesn't like us."
"Shocker," said James, grinning widely. Nobody grinned back, so he pouted instead. "Does he?" Thomas made a serious face for a moment. "You're not making him sleep in a shack in the back, are you?" Gordon, Henry, and Edward specifically all cleared their throats at different volumes and stuttered awkwardly. Everybody else was utterly lost.
"That is no longer the policy for station pilots,"
Gordon said with difficulty. "It was never the policy. It was bullying, plain and simple. We left that sort of thing in Vickerstown." Percy piped up. "Well, then why did I have to sleep in a shack? Why, that was as recent as—" Gordon coughed loudly, but no soot came out.
"It's a thing of the past, and I am quite happy to put it behind us. For the record, Diesel sleeps in the goods yard,"
and he added with insistence,
"of his own volition."
"He's a loner," added Henry, and then urgently he added to that, "We've offered him a spot in here many times, but he's turned it down every time." "Huh," pondered Thomas, about to be convinced that this wasn't more big-engine chauvinism. "Well, that's good." A grave Western accent finished Thomas's sentence for him.
"That he's turned it down, I mean. We don't want him in here. He's a menace."
Several groans greeted this, from all corners of the shed. Even Edward gave one of his little sighs.
"I don't much care for him either, Duck," admitted Boko. "He has no manners save for when he wants something. But your insistence that he's some mastermind, well,
"You're a loony!" James burst out with a cackle. "Diesel's behind everything, according to you. Stepney getting lost in the scrapyards. Devious Diesel. A mad boulder running loose in Scarlowy Quarry. Devious Diesel. The aquarium cars disappearing from our yard without a trace. Devious bloody Diesel."
To be fair, that last one was me, James. I hid them from you because you simply could not be trusted."
"You what?"
James's lip quivered miserably, and his eyes filled with longing.
"But they were so reflective."
Exactly the problem,
reiterated Duck.
They weren't much use to anyone anyway, said Henry, and he added mournfully, awfully cruel, too. We've done enough to sharks. Did you know that fishermen kill approximately
More groaning arose from all corners of the shed. Enough about the bloody fish, Henry, yelled Thomas, with a volume that clearly indicated that this was the Green Engine's third or fourth offense. I hate fish. I hate just thinking about them.
Maybe Diesel does too,
cried James, his voice radiating mockery.
Maybe he's the one who's been killing all the sharks. There's another crazy theory for your conspiracy board, Duck.
All right, come off it, James, cut in Thomas. He may have his theories, but he's not that obsessed.
No, actually, he's right. I do have one.
And with a swift motion, Duck reversed to the wall, where a rather conspicuous corkboard hung from nails in the brick. It was covered in old photographs, ledgers, receipts, and crudely cut-out photos of Devious Diesel from the television series. They were all connected in an indecipherable order with bright red string. Thomas was immediately filled with sympathy for his driver and fireman, who he had almost definitely compelled to put this thing together.
No, said Gordon loudly and with zero ambiguity. I'll make it quick this time. I have gathered more evidence. No, Gordon repeated with feeling. I am not sitting through your conspiracy theory again.
It is a little tired by this point, Duck, said Edward as gently as he could. We have all heard your reasoning already.
And yet none of you see it.
Duck gave a short squirt of defeated-looking steam.
I'm only looking out for all of your best interests. His very being here threatens us.
Oh, give it a rest, Duck, James said at a volume that suggested he was wearing humongous earmuffs.
What? Do you just not like diesels or something? I mean, come on.
One look around the room told James all he needed to know, especially Boko and Derek's expressions.
I'll shut up now.
And rather impressively, he did. Duck harumphed in a tired, beaten sort of way.
You may all think me a fool, but that's fine.
Though his tone suggested it wasn't.
I'm keeping an eye on him for all of you, and when he strikes, I will be there to thwart him.
But this was only met with a dismissive chuckle from Thomas. There'll be nothing to thwart, Duck, he reassured, but Duck did not seem to be at all at ease. He's impolite and downright mean sometimes, but that's all he is. I mean, he helped on my branch line a while back. He was actually rather decent about it.
Yes, Duck said, considering. That was awfully strange behavior for him.
Or personal growth? Posited Edward, hopefully.
Humph.
And Duck redoubled.
No such thing for a textbook psychopath like Devious Diesel.
This time the groans were accompanied by tired, angry whistles. A few engines even blew down to underscore the point.
Right. I'll shut up then.
Welcome to the club,
sniffed James, which of course meant he wasn't part of the club anymore. Things wound down after that. Arguments had grown shorter at Tidmouth Sheds over the years. It seemed everyone had more or less learned where the dead ends in conversation were. Where once bitter arguments would carry on through the night and into the morning after, now the Fat Controller's engines almost always went to bed content, if not happy. All but Duck, of course, who seemed to be having rather wretched dreams. Thomas, who was always a restless sleeper, watched the Great Western engine. Though he didn't like admitting it, Duck was one of the most reasonable engines he knew. He never jumped to conclusions, and he was committed to having all the facts before he made any assertion. The fact that he had drawn such a stark line in the ballast over this one issue was so unlike him. Thomas had to wonder if he knew something the rest of them didn't. He had trained Diesel when he'd come to take over as station pilot, the first time. Or was it the second time? Both times, Thomas concluded. Firstly, when Diesel had arrived on trial. Duck had had every right to loathe him that time. He'd nearly ruined his reputation with his ceaseless lies and treachery. The second time was when Duck had been awarded his branch line. Somebody had needed to take over for him as station pilot, and unfortunately the only available somebody had been Devious Diesel. Duck spent a week showing him the ropes. It must have been an awkward week. Maybe worse than awkward. Since then, Diesel had been sent away and invited back a whopping 7 times, and each time Duck had had choice words for him. No doubt he had antagonized the diesel engine with all his lecturing. It always got ugly between those two. But surely Diesel couldn't be what had Duck said? Osteopath? A bully, perhaps, but the notion that Diesel had any sort of master plan seemed very silly indeed to Thomas. If only he knew what tomorrow had in store.